Welcome to the Higher Love with Megan podcast with me, your host, Megan Cooper, a trauma-informed therapist, life coach and disruptor of wellness norms based in Brighton, UK. This isn't another nice-to-have wellness podcast. Instead, this podcast seeks to redefine what it means to be well in today's world. Here, we challenge the status quo, seek to reunite wellness with social justice and improve accessibility, diversity and inclusivity within wellness and beyond. As a listener, you are not here to passively consume. Instead, you are an ambassador for real, embodied, societal and systemic change in the world. As your host, I stand for radical self-inquiry and being able to have those confronting but necessary conversations so that we can remember our collective humanity at this time. We're here for the revolution and you've got a front row seat. Lewis, it is so great to be joined by you this morning. I've been so looking forward to this conversation. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Likewise, I'm really excited to have the conversation and explore some of the areas that we're both really interested and invested in. So thank you for having me.
So I would love for you to introduce yourself in any way, shape or form that feels best for you today.
My name's Lewis Wedlock. I am a masculinities educator. So I spend a lot of my time at the moment traveling around different spaces and places, mostly in the UK, talking to men, young men, educators, different people in proximity to working with young men around masculinity, violence against women and girls, misogyny, sexism. I've also been involved a lot over the years in a range of anti-oppressive work contexts. So I'm interested in decoloniality, what that looks like across education, what that looks like across culture. I love what I do, and I'm really invested in exploring those taken for granted ideas of what masculinity is seen as, how it's embodied, how it's communicated, and compassionately and curiously exploring that. So
awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I'm curious to ask you, when I find men online talking about topics that are obviously really alive for me as a woman, talking about feminism, talk about advocating for women, I'm always curious what happened to get a guy into that space. Were there some catalysts along the way to bring you into being such a strong advocate for men's well-being, but for women as well within this space?
yeah, it's an interesting one. There are many routes, and I think the more I answer the question, the more threads I unpick. But the way I've kind of explaining it and exploring it with people recently is outside of the home, which I was raised in, which was deeply loving and deeply care-centered, compassionate-centered. I existed in a cultural context in a city, Bristol, where I'm from, where specific ideas of masculinity were presented and projected. And it was something that I didn't necessarily realize I was projecting until I started really exploring my proximity to a range of different parts of my experience. For me, the entry point was really studying and sort of going to sort of higher education, being really interested in consciousness, human consciousness. But as a result of that, being fascinated by sociology, social psychology, and the intersections between those experiences. And it helped me to contextualize parts of me. But in that, I realized there's a lot I'm not really aware of myself. But it was a seed. I graduated, I experimented with a few different roles very early on in my sort of career. And then I moved into working with young people in the charity sector. For me, at the time, it was pretty much a dream job. It was a job which was encouraging young people, specifically young people racialized as Black and brown, to jump into activism and social action and explore themselves in that process. And for me, it was a case of showing young people how to do this. I need to know how to do it myself. I need to know my own inner workings as best as I can. Otherwise, it's going to become disingenuous. It's going to be kind of performative, and I don't really want to do that. That opened the door to a range of conversations for me. My racialization, the complexity of me being white passing, but racialized as brown in that space, but also a lot of the work that followed in that specific portion of my career was work with young men. And so working with young men around conversations like masculinity, men's mental health, at that early point in my career, the way I was approaching it, I was going, well, if we're not talking to the systems that are impacting some of these ideas and beliefs, then we're not helping any of these young people in the space. but I need to also facilitate that for myself. I got into a space and a career path that basically forced me to look at aspects of me that I hadn't necessarily been aware of or necessarily attuned to. And what it did for me opened up so many doors of liberation, of self-awareness. I had to go into school spaces and community spaces to talk to young people about this. It felt like an obligation, and it was uncomfortable. It wasn't necessarily something that I enjoyed, but it was something that allowed me to grow and develop in myself, but also grow and develop in the context of my community. And so that was sort of the entry point into the work. An accident in terms of it wasn't what I was expecting when I signed up for the role, but it was something that enabled me to do the work in a way that was deeply rooted in authenticity and congruence. And I've been supported across my career through many women, a lot of my lenses and a lot of my framework for how I work, but also how I explore myself. I was supervised by a range of amazing women in the sector who were calling me out and in on a lot of the things that I was bringing to the table, but allowing me to curiously explore and examine that whilst holding me firmly accountable for what I was doing and what I wasn't doing. That for me was transformative, and that's the model and the template that I use today in the space. That's the sort of entry point. It happened later in life, as it often does for men in the space that don't really inspect and examine why they do what they do. That's why I go into schools now, because the earlier we do that, the stronger that the skill is, and the more equipped young people are to exercise that skill.
Amazing. Thank you. Something that I wanted to bring in was I saw on your Instagram, you wrote, rules for 2026 are to stop blaming women for men's loneliness, stop blaming feminism for men's suffering, stop calling criticisms of masculinity misandry, believe women, explore and examine patriarchy curiously, not furiously. And when I saw that, I was like, Lewis, I'm in. I'm in with that. But my question to you is, if women are not to blame for men's loneliness, and if feminism is not the fault of men's suffering, how, in your opinion, did we arrive at where we currently are?
It's a great question. So the reason I did that post for context was because I think it's really important in any space that we set intentions really clearly for the work that's to follow. And a lot of my work speaks specifically to men directly at times, sometimes a little bit on the nose, but I think that's the way in which we have to approach it. And I think often what we're seeing at the cultural level is it's really convenient to offload the blame and the lens of men as suffering, because this feminism stuff is just taking things too far. And we know we're in this position now where men are just overlooked and just totally being ignored and bypassed. And it isn't helped that that is normalized and pushed through the algorithms too,
Yeah.
through a range of different ways and spaces. And so to answer your question, what is to blame or center in the conversation? It's the system of ideas of masculinity. For some people, they'll call it the man box. I tend to call it hyper-patriarchal cognition because I think the granularity matters. The man box is a great tool for understanding the way in which the confined ideas of masculinity trap and sort of keep men locked in a specific embodiment. But what does that is the hyper-patriarchal cognition, the things that are passed down intergenerationally about what it means to be a man. Being a man means to be emotionally stoic, which is really code for emotionally unavailable or emotionally detached. It's about exploring presentations that speak to or allude to dominance or control. And if you're in a position of dominance and control, you're not in a position of vulnerability. And if you're not in a position of vulnerability, your heart posture is not open for conversations, reflections, or real sort of accountability discourse. That systemic narrative plays into the conversations that we're having because it's convenient to deflect and say, well, it's this movement or this ethos that is trying to really speak to gender equity. I'm so used to control and I haven't named that. I'm so used to being centered and I haven't named that. I'm so used to being put in on this sort of figurative cultural pedestal, but I haven't explored or named that any form of equity discourse around fairness is automatically registered in my nervous system as attack. And as a result of that, I can easily deflect and blame women, and I can easily blame and deflect feminism or feminist men or gender equity activists, because I then don't have to look at my own proximity to the conversations around how I benefit from the system. Even if I'm struggling, even if I'm suffering, I still benefit from a system that was designed with men in mind. So when we're talking about that, for me, it's really important to center patriarchy and that conditioning in the conversation, because the way we dismantle systems is not by avoiding the systemic narrative is through actually saying, well, where did these ideas come from? Have they become normalized? How do they sit with me? And what can I do to explore that further? That's why that post for me was important, because it's speaking to the taken for grantedness and the ease of which we deflect outwards as men, generally speaking, as opposed to going, well, if I'm going to set my intentions for this year, I've really got to look at myself. I've got to look at myself and the shadows within that are so often avoided and convenient and bypassed out. That's scary. That's uncomfortable. That's dysregulating. So it's easier to go down the route of blaming everything and everyone else. I say a lot, we can't talk about masculinities discourse about naming patriarchy, but also about naming colonialism, coloniality, and also capitalism. And I think the way in which we frame that in conversations with men, masculinities, and people in general, is that yes, men are also harmed from the system of patriarchy and can be in a space and system where they are, benefited most within that space and system as well. They don't cancel each other out, but it's about recognizing you can benefit from a system and also be harmed by it. And I think that's something that really brings the nuance into the conversation in a way that allows people to not respond furiously, which is, well, you don't know my experience. You don't know what I suffer. We're not trying to make that assumption that you don't suffer. What we are naming is the fact that systemically and historically you've benefited from that. That's not saying you can't suffer. That's just saying that multiple things can be true simultaneously. And that A-B category is colonialism in action. It's either this or it's not. It's either A or it's B. It's the binariness of our experience that we've kind of lived within that creates these conditions where, well, if we're not talking about men, suffering, then we must be, against men. If we're talking about men benefiting, then we must be also against men. It's that sense of like, you can't have that complexity and that plurality, which I think is massively important in these conversations.
Yeah. And that must be something that you come up against time and time and time again, I
Yeah.
imagine, would you say? I can only imagine the pushback that perhaps you get on these conversations, you being very vocal and visible about that on social media. How is that experience for you?
It's interesting. I think, the approach I always take is the curious, not furious lens. And I think sometimes you get men that meet the content in their fury, which is sort of like, this is not right. What about this? What about that? How about this? How about that? And the way in which I often try and approach it is curiously sort of contextualizing and examining it. There is pushback in the space. There is a growing population online and also in the spaces that we exist within that are very against this work, because we've now inherited a cultural narrative that's speaking about challenging masculinity is demonizing boys and men.
Mm.
And that systemic narrative is really intentional, and it needs to be intentionally named, that decentering men in conversations is not devaluing men in conversations. And I think that approach and explaining and exploring that when there is pushback helps men to get back in their nervous system in a way that's regulated and sort of like, okay, I can kind of see where you're coming from, but also naming the fact it's interesting that you've responded in that way. Help me to understand why. Help me to understand what's coming up for you in that space. Let's name what you feel, the operative word being what you feel. Because a lot of the time men speak in generalizations of, but all men think this about, all men are, it's like, no, send to you. I feel this about men and masculinity. I feel this about the current state. Because if I can get people to name their feelings and emotions in that, we can explore that curiously. Generalizations are a bit of a buffer in that sense of like, well, all men think this. No, you feel this right now because I'm also a man in this space and we're not aligned. Let's explore that a little bit. And also recognizing that people are often naming their own dissatisfaction that often becomes projected into and onto different people. When you can center that, you can hold that with love and care and meet it with love and care. I've worked with many boys in schools that are really against what I do when they come in. But in the end of a session and an end of a space, they not only see themselves differently, they see the work differently. And that's because I approach it with the love and care, as opposed to that sense of what I call shame-based teaching, where it's like, you think that is disgusting. It's very curious. And that's kind of how I navigate in those spaces.
Before we go on, I'd so appreciate you to hit follow or subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, click those 3 little dots next to settings to rate the show. On Apple Podcasts, you can leave a review or take a moment to explore how you can rate or review on the platform that you're listening or watching. This makes a difference. I truly believe we need to have more of these conversations to shake up the status quo. We'll beat the algorithm together with your clicks and shares. Now back to the episode. I found your work actually after I had made a video on not all men. And it was a clip from a Sky News interview where Patsy Stevenson, who's a women's equality advocate and activist, came on Sky News, and the whole conversation got derailed. And I made a video about this, and I actually said, please tag guys doing the work. I desperately want to find people. I'm glad that I put that in, because I found so many amazing guys in the space doing great work that I otherwise wouldn't have found. But it was so interesting for me that I made a video about the not all men, and the amount of pushback to that was just, I mean, I wasn't prepared for it. My husband was reading the comments and he was like, oh my God, went into a deep existential crisis for about a week, being like, what is this world? But I just wanted to ask you, in your own words, in your own experience, to talk about this not all men thing, because I think we get so easily derailed on this not all men debate.
Yeah, great question. And the video you posted as well was fantastic as well. It really spoke to a lot of things that I feel as well. And I think it's something it comes up a lot in my work. It's something that I'm often in proximity to. And to really name the pervasiveness of it, it often comes from my experience, people in positions of leadership and positions of power too. And it's also embedded across aspects of way in which the work is kind of frameworked. Just make sure that boys know that it's not all men, and that, men can be, X, Y, and Z, which is never the point of the conversation. And I think what's really interesting about this is one of the default reactions to men being in positions where masculinity is challenged and critiqued, and their nervous system's not being able to view challenge and critique not as evidence of personal inadequacy, but of structural critique and structural examination. The nervous system registers it as attack of me individually, as opposed to us culturally and systemically. And as a result of that, there are many men that get in the defense mode of this is an attack on men, when really it's an invitation for reflection and curiosity. And most men, if we're going to be really spicy in terms of the conversation, most men don't like to hear critiques of masculinity from men, but specifically women and gender, plural and expansive people that speak to their experience in a way that they haven't been able to name. That's something that creates that, well, what do you know about? How do you know about? That's not the case. I would never do that. And it's about really getting into the granularity of that, of, all men, okay, let's explore this. Perhaps this is how I do it in my work, okay. Perhaps all men don't physically harm women in the context. But let me ask you a direct question. How many times do you check your friends for comments or jokes, inverted commas for the people listening to audio, or the banter that's occurring that can cause harm? How often do you go, I'm not quite sure about that, and here's why? How often do you watch something, an interaction in public, and you go, oh, it's a bit uncomfortable, I'm just going to go the other way. I'm just going to pretend I didn't see that. Yeah. All of a sudden, that all men aspect becomes a little bit more expansive. You might not directly commit or be involved in the actions, but your lack of engagement, metaphorically and literally, enables this harm to occur. So by extension, all men are involved in this. Even the men that are in positions of influence in feminist circles. I did a post recently and it ruffled a few feathers, but that's what I'm here to do. It's like, we need to stop platforming feminist men in a way that makes bare minimum participation look heroic. Because what we're really doing is speaking to, hey, we should really be a bit more attuned to the experience of other people. And we should be really attuned to not making it about us. Platforming men that do the work is really kind of making this seem as if this is super heroic when it's actually bare minimum participation. So that's how I feed into the all men space. I'm contextualizing that we're looking at it from the space of, but the data, this, and this, but also thinking about how often, as a man, have you watched something occur and said nothing? Think about the culture of it's none of my business. We have a culture of it's not my business, I'm not getting involved, specifically as men, that enables a lot of these ideas around violence against women and girls, misogyny and sexism to occur, in addition to a lot of these harmful ideas around masculinity and expressions of masculinity. We just don't want to look at it. And that avoidance compounds our complicity. And as a result of that, all men are involved in some way, shape, or form. It's tough to hear, but it's something we must center in the conversation.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, the kind of translation of how in all systems of oppression, in systems around whiteness, for
Yeah.
example, it's like not all white people, but always a white person is another
Mm-hmm.
way of doing it. And I suppose within this conversation of not all men, but always a man is another way to see it. So instead of seeing it as this kind of like attack and something to defend against and critique, it's actually how can I evolve from this? What is
Sure.
being said here? And you said it at the beginning of the conversation, it's instead of seeing as this kind of like calling out, it's calling in. How do I see myself within this space?
Yeah.
How have I contributed? How would you say that? You're going to say it much better than me.
Uh, For me, how I like to kind of explore it is any invitation to explore and expand on yourself is not evidence of inadequacy. It's
Mm,
just an invitation to explore and examine further. And that's come from, to be really, really real, like being in spaces where maybe at times the younger versions of me have been a bit defensive, and I've tried to intellectualize, and I've tried to sort of go into a sort of, well, let's explore that. And every single time I've tried to do that, the compassionate pushback was, you're going into a space that's comfortable. It's comfortable to intellectualize. It's not comfortable to metabolize. It's not comfortable to actually go, this doesn't serve a purpose. It's not comfortable to go, actually, that's on me. But that's
mm,
what we need to do. And we often talk about, what I often call out in the space is, certain optimization cultures talk about the constant need to evolve, adapt, improve. We somehow avoid ideas of masculinity in that conversation
mm,
and ideas of gendered experience specifically. It's like we'll evolve everywhere else except
mm.
the embodiment of our identified gendered experience. That for me is very interesting to explore,
Yeah.
especially in the hyper-patriarchal capitalist culture. So that's kind of how I frame it.
I'm so pleased that you just brought that in because that's something that I've reflected on recently, actually. That,
Mm-hmm.
I have worked within the wellness, the therapeutic space for 10 years. I know
Mm-hmm.
a lot of brilliant men in the
Mm-hmm.
space. And these conversations around misogyny, violence against women, I've met guys who've done loads of work on themselves in so many areas and do great work, but yet have not entered into this aspect of work.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that so curious. And,
Mm-hmm.
again, it's systemic, right? But I'm curious kind of what your experience of that is.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think for me, what it is there is a safety to not being visible, and there is a safety to not being accountable for what you say and what you do and what you don't do. Many, and from my experience, and I can only speak from my experience working with men and professionals across the space, is that there is a fear of being seen as either getting something wrong or coming across the wrong way that takes precedence over the importance of modeling the work. Because if you don't model the work, how can you provide a template for other people to expand and explore it? Which is why for me, I'm always very open in terms of where I'm at in my position. And I always name that it's kind of where I feel and what I feel about it. Because what I feel can be challenged, it can be explored, it can be expanded upon. There's something petrifying about being challenged publicly and putting a little bit of a target on your back when you speak against some of the systemicness that we're speaking to here. And I
Yeah.
think it's that cost of allyship. I think the way it's coming to me right now is that they want the membership, but they don't necessarily want the, work that comes with it. They want
Mm,
the sort of, oh, I'm in the club, but they don't necessarily want the, well, how did you get into the club? What does that work look like? And I think it's that distinction between getting people in a space and position where, for me, I think a lot of the reason why people disengage, specifically men, is because it's still about them in the conversation. I've done the work and I've intellectualized and I've read the books and I've done the work on myself to a degree which is comfortable. When it requires me to use that work in a space where I'm against people that might not see me eye to eye, that's where I draw the line. That's where I'm pulling myself out of the space, but it's there where the work is most potent. It's there where the skill sets that you've accumulated can be used in a really, transformative and person-centered way. But it's that fear of it's still about me. I'm still in a position where I need to safeguard my ability to feel like I'm doing something right. And if someone tells me I've done something wrong or not quite right, I'm not in a position to be able to do that. That's what I've observed generally speaking, as a trend in the space.
Yeah. Yeah, that resonates so much. I would say there are so many men out there who probably identify themselves as being the good guys, the nice guys, the not harmful guys. And in many respects, they are good guys. I've many friends. I'm married to an amazing man. There are great men out there. But so many of those guys perhaps don't involve themselves in the debate, as we have just said.
Mhm.
Seems to be a gap between actually jumping in and doing the work to like step into allyship, addressing this stuff and naming it and, visibly and vocally standing against something else. And that for me, I would say generates quite a lot of fear, as
Mhm.
a woman, of safety of women, but also where we're going. There have been so many things that I've seen in the last couple of weeks where I'm like, God, and there are very few men naming and addressing this online that I have come across. And this huge bank of good guys, in inverted commas, who also say nothing. And
Mhm.
I'm curious for you how you feel we get over that hump of like guys actually like taking the step to be like, yeah, shit, I do need to step in. I do need to do more.
That's a great question. I've written about this a little bit in my book, but also just online. I think the binary culture creates the impression of A or B. And so I've written before about why I typically tend to move away from labels such as healthy and toxic masculinity, not because those behaviors around men and what behaviors men normalize don't cause harm. That's not what I'm saying. But the labels create the impression that there is a wholly good and a wholly bad. And really, what I'm looking for to normalize in the conversation is a wholeness culture where we talk about good men and what good men look like. And I think good men get so caught up centering themselves in I'm good that any challenge is seen as, well, that means I'm not good anymore. What wholeness looks to do and seeks to do is recognize that and lenses are really important in this work. I can be someone that is actively trying to dismantle the systems that exist around me and also simultaneously benefit from that system and also simultaneously uphold it. That's a complexity to the human experience that we often don't name. And a lot of men are so caught up with the label of being the good guy that they're so afraid of losing the good guy label, they don't participate. That's a problem because wholeness culture for me is about recognizing I can do the work, I can participate, and I can also be held accountable. I can also be challenged. I can also hold my hands up and go, that was on me. I did something that wasn't quite appropriate and I'm going to amend and change that and I'm going to move forward with that in the context of the conversation. For me, wholeness culture allows us to embrace the plurality of human experience and specifically for men who are in that process of trying to dismantle but also figuring out how they uphold the system at the same time. But sometimes figuring out how they uphold that system is so soul destroying because they're trying to be good men that it's like, I don't really want to participate and engage with that. It's not about that process of holding on to a label because holding on to a label without any action is just kind of, it's performative stuff, right? And so for me, I would much rather be in a position where I'm challenged and I'm able to amend and I'm able to reposition and recalibrate and actually be, held accountable for the things that I'm doing and also what I'm not doing instead of pretending like I'm doing something useful. That's the case that we need to make. And often what people say to me is, well, Lewis, in order to do that, we've got to kind of create space for men, it's got to be a space where we're talking at men constructively and with care and compassion. And I'm like, what you're using there as language to sort of make the space comfortable. I'm talking about brave spaces as well as safe spaces. Appeasing your desire to be comfortable often bypasses your route into the work that's necessary. Sometimes you need to be brave, not safe. Sometimes you need to step into the uncomfortable instead of, oh, just talk to me nicely and I'll participate. Because then that's always about you, not about the systemic conversation. So that's how I approach it. For me, I feel like the goodness and badness culture that we exist within creates this polarity that doesn't exist. I think the
Mm,
wholeness is important because I am challenged just as much as I challenge other aspects. Because
yeah.
for me, that's important. If I cannot put my ideas on the line to be challenged and to explored further and to be held under the microscope and amend where necessary and where appropriate and when applicable, I'm not doing the work that I'm saying I'm meant to do. So that's how I approach that in the conversations and the work that follows.
Yeah. And I hear within that as well that this work is inherently uncomfortable,
Yeah.
and also you are going to get things wrong.
Hmm.
And I think that was really a helpful shift for me. I used to think that conversations about racism didn't apply to me because I was a good, nice person. And then as soon as I really got with the program and was like,
Hmm.
oh, hang on, as a white woman from Britain, I fundamentally uphold systems of oppression. And therefore, I need to deeply interrogate my biases, look how I benefit from the system, and get really comfortable with being uncomfortable and really okay with the fact that I am going to get things wrong because I'm already getting things wrong unconsciously, but I'm just going to offer myself up uncomfortably to exploring this. When I really got okay with having that beginner's mindset, made peace with the discomfort, it meant that I could just take a step into the threshold.
100%, 100%. And the same applies, for me in this space too. I think once you accept challenge as that evidence of evolving as opposed to evidence of inadequacy, you remove the shame that comes with it, and you remove that, oh gosh, I'm not good enough, I'm not right for this, and you step into that calibration posture where it's like, okay, cool, I can amend. Okay, cool, I can see where that's coming from. It's not nice and it's not comfortable, but it's also necessary, which is why I'm an advocate for safety sometimes where necessary, but also bravery, specifically in some of these conversations. One of the tools that I use when I work with young people, specifically young men, is I'm really intentional with what I name. So
Yeah.
as part of like the core agreements of the space that I'm facilitating, I'll say, look, today you're gonna experience maybe some challenge. I want to be really clear with you. I'm challenging the ideas that you hold, not the person behind these ideas. Because ideas are a little bit like pick and mix. I can pick them up, I can swap them out. I can say, I'm not quite sure about that now. I'm going to switch that with something else. Everything that we're challenging in this space are the ideas that we hold, which aren't rooted to our skeleton, aren't like nailed in the sense of like, now I'm locked in with this for life. The things that we borrow. So when I'm challenging you, I'm naming before we even get into it, the idea over the person. Because a lot of the time, the challenge of ideas, because we haven't interrogated what we think really and truly. And I see this a lot with young men and masculinities. There's often a regurgitation of what they might have consumed, what they might be consuming, but not an embodied, reflexive, personally articulated response. So I've got to challenge the idea and recognizing that the idea isn't rooted to the person. The idea can be shifted and amended. And that's really helpful in creating that safety in that space. But a point comes where that safety needs to move into bravery, where it's like, I need you now to name that we're challenging that idea. And we're going to challenge this idea together. It's going to be uncomfortable. But how we do that is by naming that the ideas are being challenged, not the soul of the person in the space that's articulating them. As a result of that, you can kind of see that idea person separation, which then creates room to look at the idea in context, as opposed to I'm defending my personal reputation when I have this idea and this personal experience that lands this idea. We're looking at the idea isolated from the person, which then creates room for that critical discourse
Yeah.
and that considering of different ideas and perspectives.
Mm. Yeah, it's really helpful. Something that comes up for me, and I know that we've touched on this already, is that whenever I, as a woman, have tried to center the female experience, the experience of women, um, and just naming a few of those things and I know that you've spoken about this online, 1 million cases in the
Mhm,
UK are recorded per year.
mhm.
A woman is killed every 3 days in the
Yeah,
UK by a man. These are really serious
for sure.
statistics.
Absolutely.
And I keep thinking of that quote, Margaret Atwood, where men are afraid that women will laugh at them. Women are afraid that men will kill them. Whenever I have tried to name that as a statistics, these are facts, this is what is happening. And then the pushback is, well, this is misandry. You're pushing back against men. This isn't men's fault, blah, 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 blah. I find that so difficult, so
Of
difficult to
course.
reach out to because I suppose I feel it viscerally. I feel that kind of fury and grief, I suppose, of the female experience within that. How do you speak to that specifically?
I think there's something really important about naming, like you've done there, is naming that when you're naming these stats and these figures and the realities, let's really frame that. The reality of violence against women and girls, misogyny and sexism at its most dangerous and at its most violent expression, when you're met in conversations or statements that you're making in relation to stats, and the reaction is often, well, what's the source for that? Or that's not true. Or, as you've mentioned, thanks for just adding to the misandry conversation, the embodied response to that is someone that's both existed in the space, in the system, experience in the system, and trying to dismantle the system. That plurality there is going to it's going to create a very valid fury response. And I think there's something about, this is why in the space, having people in the conversation that are able to step in and hold those conversations is massively important. There's something that I was mentioning around the time adolescence was out, and it was sort of saying they want to show adolescence in schools and in lessons. And I was like, one thing I'm missing is that 70% of the UK teacher force at this current moment are women. So you're asking women to show a clip that's polarizing whilst having to explore and navigate fury in that space while simultaneously experiencing this in the school space, in culture, and then, basically centering that in the discourse. That's not protecting, that's endangering. And so to go back to the point around the conversations around it's misandry or you're just a man hater, one of the things that I'm really keen on communicating in those spaces is that men specifically, what I've seen in the work, will often look at stats and figures that only benefit their worldview. So they will bring a specific frame, and that's not true because of that's not true because of this. But the actual femicide census that came out this year, that's really unpacked some of that data. The stats and figures that you've mentioned, these are validated figures and not something we're plucking out. But there's something about naming this is just hating men. And what that serves to do in the conversation is it serves to center men's feelings in conversations about women's experiences and women's realities. And what we often do in the conversation is culturally, we've appeased this. We've kind of said, okay, that's fine. Let's center your experience in that conversation. One of the things that I do, and it's happening more frequently in the work that I post online, that response of, yeah, but what about men in this context? And I just name it really directly. You're choosing to center your feelings or men's feelings in a conversation that's speaking to the reality of violence against women and girls. One of the things I hear in the space is, well, what are we doing about, the context of men who are also impacted by male violence? That's not to say men impacted by male violence aren't important in the conversation, but bringing that into a conversation about women's experience is derailing. That's not unkind. That's not unfair to state. That's about recognizing what we're speaking to and how important it is to center the main thing in the conversation. And I think the wave of the use of, oh, this is, misandrist, or, this is, this idea that misandry and misogyny are equally oppressive forces is something I'm really dismantling in the work. Because one of the things that's really important to me to state in that space is that if we want to use the term, which for me, I'm a bit critical of it in context for a range of reasons, but for the purpose of this conversation, I often explain misandry as an exercise of precaution. When you look at the data, when you look at what's going on and around us, when you look at this sense of disproportionately men committing acts of violence against women and girls, there is a precautionary function to that. I'm not sure I need to keep myself safe. When we're speaking to misogyny, we're talking about a systemically normalized hatred of women. We're talking about a systemically normalized acts of violence, acts of oppression against women that benefits men. They are not the same thing. They're not the same thing in the conversation. And making the argument that they are creates this whataboutery that decenters women's experiences in conversation about women's experiences. So that is something that I think is really important to name in the space. Not that men's experiences aren't important or that need to be explored. That work is happening. But when you're centering it in conversations about women's experiences and trying to center your own innocence or your own kind of uncomfortability, for me, it can't be allowed to happen. And there's nothing wrong with naming that. And there's nothing wrong with making that case in point. Because one of the things that patriarchy specifically as a system likes to do is it likes to cast judgment on people that call out the realities of what's going on.
Yeah.
It likes to make you feel like, maybe I shouldn't have said that then if that's coming in. Am I wrong for saying that? And as a result of that, you don't post as much. As a result of that, you don't make that same content. As a result of that, you come offline. As a result of that, the patriarchal cognition wins because you've been encouraged through that action of, what about, to disengage. And as a result of that, that centering takes place. So if anyone's listening to this and you're in that space and you're in that boat, recognize that the challenge of naming that isn't something that is, evidence of, am I doing the wrong thing? You're engaging with that cognition in action, the idea in action. And I think what is important is that there are people out there that are doing this work that can speak to this. Signpost them over to us or signpost them into that space. You don't need to be in the comments responding and reacting to every comment, because you have to protect yourself in that process too. You're experiencing and navigating and advocating for something that you're really experiencing in a plural manner. There's nothing wrong with just going like, hey, check out this person or check out this work. You don't have to justify your point. Your point is valid. Your point is real. And naming that in the conversation isn't a man-hating action. It's a calibrating statement for the conversation around gender equity. So I went off a bit of a rant there, but I feel really strongly about this at the minute. So I just want to name that.
Excellent. Me too.
Okay.
No, I mean, there's so many great things in there. And I think, you touched on such an important thing too, that we've been so conditioned in the hyper-capitalist, hyper-patriarchal, hyper-white supremacy culture that we're in. It condones obedience. It condones being nice, not rocking the boat, not calling stuff out. Like another hurdle that I've had to get over myself of not being the inverted commas good girl, or women especially are conditioned to kind of like just play along and be nice and all these things.
Sure.
And actually it's really being bold. And I love, you used the word brave earlier on in the conversation. I think these qualities of boldness and bravery are so important at the times through which we're living. When men are moving through this work and, we've named some of the barriers that come up immediately, I'm curious for you kind of if there are any other barriers that you generally see. We've named shame, projection, so that, any guy listening to this who's wanting to go on a bit of a journey needs to look out for and be like, oh, okay, that's part of the course.
Yeah, I've touched on it briefly, but I think I mentioned it earlier on, this idea of not allowing I don't want to say praise, but recognizing that what we're doing when we're speaking out of these spaces is like, in the nicest way, bare minimum participation. And so this elevation of, well, I often see a haughtiness that comes with it after a while. It's like, well, have you not read this book? And are you not in this space? How can you not know that? It's like, bro, you were there 6 months ago. You were there a year ago. And I think that's something that's really important, the grace that we give other people in the space in their own learning journeys, but also recognizing that what we're doing is something that in the history of gender equity space and movements historically has not included men's participation in the space. Yes, there's people stepping in and people doing the work, but this is a very, very recent, I suppose, participation, generally speaking. And I think it's about recognizing that what we're doing is bare minimum in this space. And it doesn't require the medal, the pat on the back. If you're doing it for that reason, name it and metabolize it now. Because this isn't about how we're seen by others. It's about what we use in the space that we take up to bring attention to the systemic injustice, to the conversations that are uncomfortable. It's not about us. It's about how we support women and gender expansive people in the conversations who are impacted by patriarchy. It's about naming some of those spaces. It's about naming and speaking to men about some of the ideas that we've inherited. It's about being of service in the space, not being kind of like elevated or seen as, someone doing, revolutionary work. Because really and truly, a lot of men in this space, myself included, the lenses that we've created, curated, are built off of the labor and the academic insights and the lived experience insights of women. And so for us to come in and kind of take that credit, for me, has always felt stinky. It's like, we're standing on very big shoulders, very influential and massively, calibrating shoulders. And I think for us, it's about being okay with not being center stage. And if you're good with that, then you're able to step into that. And it takes time because we're used to and conditioned in the space to always expect that. But that for me is a marker of I'm prepared to step in, because I'm prepared to be decentered, not because I'm devalued, but because I've been systemically valued across time and space historically, and I need to make it equitable. Often I hear about equality, and I think equality speaks to sameness, equity speaks to fairness. I'm interested in gender equity. I'm interested in that fairness. I'm interested in naming what has come before and what's needed to move forward. So if you call it that, amazing. That's what we need to do, and that's what we should all be going in this space.
Love that. I love that qualification of being decentered, but not being devalued, and the difference between equality and equity. That's really something that's going to really stick with me. So thank you. That's really helpful. I wanted to ask you about a little bit more about your work with young boys, teenagers. I see a lot of information on how younger generations coming through are far more open to a lot of conversations. But then I also see things like a third of young boys think feminism has gone too far. A high proportion of 14 to 17-year-old girls have already experienced violence in relationship. So that I get kind of conflicting information of like, things are going better, and then more information of like, oh no, things are looking way worse. I'm curious how your experience is working with young boys and teenagers. What do you think the kind of shape of new generations coming through is looking like?
I think the new generation's hopeful, but I think the new generation needs to be approached intentionally, consistently.
Mm,
Because I think one of the things, someone who I'm a touch point away from the generations that I work with, but our experiences are radically different. I think the intention in this work is massively important, because yes, young people are open for the conversations, but young people are also bringing in, from my experience, really strong echo chambered opinions that are often regurgitations of what they see online, that need to be explored and consistently challenged, consistently being the sort of operative term, in the space. One of the things I find particularly interesting in my work, specifically around masculinity, and it's kind of been backed up a little bit recently with the Voice of the Boys report that came out a few months ago at the time of recording, and also, the sort of other pieces of work, the State of UK Boys, etc. But I think for me, one of the things that's really important is that most boys don't really understand what masculinity is, but they have ideas about what it means to be a man. But those
mm,
ideas are often fed from the echo chambers. When you ask people who they might see online, they often name the people that we might want to critically explore and expand on and challenge. And I think the reality is, and I was having this conversation with someone the other day who was kind of saying, we need to be careful not victimizing boys in the context of education. And I was like, we need to be also careful that we're not bypassing the realities of what we're speaking to, which is anecdotally and also more from a data perspective, emerging data section space now, we're seeing harassment cultures in schools
yeah.
towards teachers and peers. We're also seeing hypersexualization in those spaces. Also seeing a range of different rejections and deflections when it comes to conversations around accountability,
Mm,
because schools are a microcosm of wider culture and society. What
yeah.
people are seeing and experiencing outside makes its way into the school space. And that's important to name. The generation's heart postures are absolutely calibrated for critical conversation, but we also need to calibrate them for critical conversation. That can only be done consistently. It's not an assembly, one-off workshop. It's how you're embedding that into the school culture consistently that matters. Just because young people are more politically aware and conscious doesn't mean that they don't need to have that consistent touch point to reflect and examine their ideas. Because I have seen ideas of masculinity that are like for like in terms of what's seen in some of the spaces that we occupy and exist in online that are quite harmful. But I've also seen that heart posture evolve over time through that consistent engagement. And I think that's important to name. It's not about victimizing boys and creating this idea that every single boy is a criminal in the making, or someone that can create or perpetuate violence. But we have to be really clear. The data is telling us disproportionately men in the current context, right? So the conversations around masculinity need to not necessarily be naming that age appropriately, but having those conversations and exploring what masculinity means early on. Because if boys have an understanding about what masculinity is early on, and that is a construction, not something that is a contract, you get to create it, you get to embody it, you get to design and sort of explore, as opposed to, I have to be this way or else. You start that younger and younger, then you have a platform to build on. So I think it's a sense of heart postures are there, but the work needs to be intentional and consistent across time and space. Otherwise, the data that you've brought in is a reality, and I'm seeing more and more of that coming in, which is why that consistency needs to be really present across school cultures.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. My final question for you is,
Hmm.
sometimes hope can feel a little bit,
Hmm.
especially when we are constantly being given news of Grok, AI, undressing women and children on the internet, when
Yep.
abortion rights seem to be up for debate, when women are experiencing the violence that they are on a day-to-day basis.
Yep.
How do you and how can we keep hope continuously alive?
It's a great question. And I think for me, what I try and do is, I'm not always great at it, but I think it's really important. And I was having a conversation recently with a group of young activists and young sort of change makers, holding space for them, and who are sharing very similar sort of sentiments and realities to what you were talking about there. And I say hope is crafted through how we model our own self-care in a systemic space that is designed to burn us out, exhaust us, and create the conditions in our exhaustion that we can't participate. Self-care in this context is massively important. And one of the things that I've recently been talking about a lot is you don't have to engage and consume everything to be actively involved. And the hope that comes from it is that, for me, I'm hopeful knowing that a rested me and a calibrated me, an intentional me, is much more useful to the conversations that we're having. Someone that is exhausting themselves, trying to get up to date with every single thing, process and watch awful videos, traumatic videos. There's a difference between being informed and being continuously exposed to traumatic stimuli. And I think that's something that we need to be really clear and intentional with. So my hope comes from the fact that, and this has taken me a while to do this, to be really honest, but how I look after myself and how I look after and model self-care to other generations, specifically the younger generations coming up that are watching people like myself in the space, watching the work that I do. What I do in terms of my output and the work I do is important, but also how I model self-care and how I model intention and how I model regulating my own nervous system and how I model that process is something that I rely on for hope.
Mm.
Because the cyclical nature of respond, react, exhaust, detract is something that really exists in this space. I've gone through a few of these loops over the past 6 years myself, culturally and communally, and it really dawned on me that the way in which the systems that we speak to are able to last as long as they do is because they bank on our exhaustion and they bank on our disengagement and they bank on a fear of I can't do it anymore, I tapped out. So intentionally prioritizing rest. Gina Martin calls it vitamin R, like vitamin rest, and coming off
Oh, I love that.
the internet. And I think that's really cool. Um, uh, and I think that is massively important because this is a long-term movement and conversation. Right now, what we're seeing and the influx of what we're seeing and how fast it's coming at us feels like we have to react, which we do, but it's
Yeah.
not always on us, the individual, to react. If we stay in that collective space and prioritize rest, prioritize engagement, intentional of how we do and what we respond to, that for me is where my hope comes from. I'm hopeful about building cultures where self is prioritized in the structural movements, where we're approaching this as rested and as calibrated as we can, as opposed to burned out and dysregulated. And the activists and the social commentators that I see, younger generations, are actively practicing this. And that gives me hope because they are seeing and acknowledging I don't want to say the mistakes, but they're seeing and acknowledging the patterns previous generations and amending and sort of calibrating. That for me is what gives me hope. But you have to prioritize yourself in that process.
Yes. Yes. Definitely a practice, isn't it?
Hmm. For sure.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'd love to ask you for any recommendations that you have for people who are listening to this conversation. Where can I go from here? I know that you've got your book, Masculinity in Schools, which I need to read.
Yeah, I think for me, there's a range of things that are useful. I think anything bell hooks for me
Oh,
personally, and I'm naming my bias, but I think their work was massively pivotal for me. in specifically someone racialized as brown in the space, but the analysis of patriarchy, colonialism, how it impacts and influences us all was transformative for me. It names the system as much as the embodied experience, which I think is brilliant. There's a book that I read probably about 6 months ago that really helped contextualize the misandry, misogyny conversation, which is a book from Pauline Homage called I Hate Men. And I think it was banned in France at one point because of the title. I believe, I might be mistaken. It's a very short read, but for me, it was really collaborative in understanding the precautionariness of holding men at a sort of an arm's length, and that sort of conditioned reaction to misogyny across time and culture. The Jack Holland's A Brief History of Misogyny is also a really good book. One of the things I'm seeing a lot is that misogyny is a recent cultural emergence. It's been present across time and space as far back as ancient Greece, how those ideas have become normalized across time and space. Podcasts, Crime Analyst is a great podcast that for me that speaks to specifically violence against women and girls, but across the sort of judiciary system, etc. But a range of different people and topics in the space that I think are really useful and potent. I think creators as well online, if you're not into the longer form, people like What Makes a Man or Andrew Bernie Bernard, creators that speak to some of the things that we've discussed in this space, I think are massively important. Hey Brother Johnny, you'll find a few of us because we're all in the comments of each other, because I think another thing that gives us hope is that if you're a person listening to this and going, well, men don't speak about this, there are a few of us out there, and there's an increasing population of us speaking into this space. And if you go to any of our pages, you'll see them in the comments. I also think what's really important as well is following women and gender expansive voices in the space too. So for me, Gina Martin is someone that I really appreciate. There are a range of people that I think are massively important in the space. So find one of us and connect and just expand that out.
Yeah, find one and you find them all.
Absolutely.
No, I definitely experienced that. I think it's such an important part of that hope component as well, that we continue to find each other, people doing great work, collaborate, join forces, explore each other's work, and continue to learn from each other, continue to build community. Was there anything, Lewis, that you wanted to bring into the conversation that we haven't already touched upon?
I think one of the things I've been really trying to be intentional with recently in the public space is naming, because there'll be people listening to this podcast that are navigating a lot of what we've discussed and are feeling like, am I doing the right thing, or am I able to do this? Is this right? I can't deal with the responses that I'm getting in person or online. And I think, just to reiterate what we talked about earlier on, I think it's really important in this space to surround yourselves, whether it's online or in the community space, with people that are creating the content. Because one of the things for me that fallout from adolescence did was it brought a lot of similar creative voices and academic voices and people in the space together in a way that even for us, we didn't know people were existing in this particular way. And so for me, what you're doing in challenging those spaces is needed and necessary. Taking a step back to recalibrate and recuperate is not evidence of you being out of the fight. It's evidence of you replenishing the stores to go again. The moment we start thinking, I'm beating myself up because I'm not involved, is the moment that we burn ourselves out of perceived obligation. Sustained action, consistent action over like fast reactive consumption and creation, always. So if you're listening to this and that resonates, just know you're not alone in that space. There's many of us that feel it. And for me, prioritizing like our own energy capacity in this is hugely important for the work that's to follow. Keep going. Blessings to you. And if you haven't heard that, that's for you.
And thank you so much, Lewis. All of your contact information will be in the show notes so people can find you, find your content. And thank you so much for this conversation. Hopefully I can get you back again for a part 2 sometime.
Amazing. Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Lewis. It's been awesome. Thank you for listening. It's great to have you with me on this journey towards higher love for all. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. please do take a moment to rate and review the show, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. All links, references and contact information is detailed too within the show notes. And I always love to hear your feedback, so feel free to hit me up on my Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan or via my website higher-love.com. Send your takeaways, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share or send on to someone else who would benefit. Until next time, big love.